Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Fiona Lowenstein, Dona Kim Murphey, and the Long COVID Survival Guide. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You are muted. You may use the question box to send us your questions. You'll see the question box at the bottom of the screen. You can just enter a question there during the webinar, and our presenters will see it. We'll take as many questions as time permits. For those of you who'd like to watch this again or share it with a friend, all of our webinars are recorded and made available a few days after the initial broadcast on our respective websites. And you can find our webinars on YouTube at www.youtube.com/solveme. And one last note, SolveMe is unable to provide medical or legal advice during these webinars. So please keep that in mind when you're submitting your questions. And with that covered, I'll turn the mic over to our Director of Development, Joe Komsky.
Welcome, everybody. Before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that as we approach the end of the year, we are in the middle of our end of year campaign, where we raise the money that helps us fund the research and the patient services and advocate for more government funding for research and acknowledgement of the diseases that we help. So right now, also, we have a $500,000 double your donation campaign. Any gifts between now and December 31st will be matched up to a total of $500,000. You can visit solveme.org/donate to give today. So we are very, very excited to welcome Fiona Lowenstein and Dona Kim Murphey to talk about their book, The Long COVID Survival Guide. Fiona is an award-winning journalist, producer, speaker, and the founder of Body Politic, a grassroots patient-led health justice organization. Lowenstein was hospitalized for COVID-19 in March 2020 and went on to found the Body Politic COVID-19 support group, which offers support and resources to over 11,000 people living with COVID-19 around the world. Their work has been published in the New York Times, Vox, Teen Vogue, The Guardian, and many more. And they are the editor of the Long COVID Survival Guide, How to Take Care of Yourself and What Comes Next. They live in Los Angeles with their partner. And Dona Kim Murphey is a neurologist, neuroscientist, historian of science, and community organizer who organizes at the intersections of race, poverty, immigration, and health. She has been a strong health advocate during the pandemic, even as she herself struggled with long COVID. Understanding the intimate relationship between the health of individuals, the health of our communities, and the health of our democracy, she ran for her local school board in Pearland, Texas in 2019 and co-founded the patient-centered, justice and equity-oriented political action committee, Doctors in Politics. Driven by the very same ethics, she has now co-founded a public benefit health tech startup that seeks to increase culturally fluent and language-specific access to health information to reduce health disparities in dementia screening and counseling. Fiona, Donna, thank you so much for joining us. And let's talk about your book. And let's begin with just sort of, what are the origins? How did this come up? What inspired you to write it? What do you hope to accomplish with it? You know, give us in general the details on the book and how you got into this.
Well, thanks so much for having us, Joe. I think the book came together in a few different ways. First off, Donna and I met, via the nexus of patient activism, of patient-led long COVID activism, through groups like Body Politic and the Patient-Led Research Collaborative and, social media sites like Twitter, where patients were really gathering and sharing information in the early days of the pandemic and, are still sharing information as we kind of wait for better answers from research and science. And so I think the book is, our attempt to provide patients with some of that information that we have gathered over the past, 2+ years. It's also our attempt to kind of provide patients with the emotional support that we found in those early support groups. And I also want to note that a lot of the information that we gathered in those early days came from, MECFS, people living with MECFS who had resources and, guidance that really came from their lived experience of dealing with similar symptoms and similar experiences trying to find care for years prior to the pandemic. So we felt like there was a need to kind of put that information in a book for folks who aren't able to access a support group or might find, a support group initially overwhelming, or just really want a secondary source to be able to turn to. And my feeling was that a book like this really needs to be authored by a diverse group of people, because these symptom presentations are diverse and the experiences, of course, range depending on who you are and where you're trying to access care.
There's on the back of the book, as part of the description, it is described as a support group in book form. I would imagine that's really, really important for people, because the lack of consistent care across the world, there are probably lots of people who are living in places where they don't have access to doctors who understand the disease, nor do they necessarily have access to a group of people that they can talk to and share this information, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, in one of our previous events a couple of days ago, JD Davids, who's another one of the contributors to the book, said, for illnesses like this, we know that, who you are and where you are really does matter when you're trying to seek access to this care. We also know that, even affluent white patients with insurance are having trouble getting diagnosed. So this is a widespread issue, and the topics that we're trying to tackle in this book, from medical gaslighting, and how to navigate healthcare systems, which is something that Donna's chapter really touches on and goes pretty deep into, to how to, navigate workplace accommodations. I think those are through lines that are unfortunately very necessary for a lot of patients, kind of regardless of their circumstances, and will remain important even after a point where we have, potentially successful treatments.
I just wanted to comment further that I think the way you framed the question was about the global relevance of the book. And I think that that's certainly true. But I think it's important to acknowledge that also within the United States, it's very much the case that certain populations don't have the same kind of access as other populations. And so it's important, I think, that we have resources like this that empower us with information to do something about our own condition.
Thank you. Fiona, what criteria did you use to assemble the contributors, and maybe take us through the chapters of the book so people sort of know what subjects are covered?
Yeah, definitely. So I was looking, I would say the book kind of has three primary goals. The first is, once again, to provide that emotional support. The thing that people so often say when they enter the Body Politic support group or other support groups is, the first thing that we see them write is, oh my gosh, I thought I was alone, or, it's really amazing to see this experience validated. And so, in many ways, I wanted this book to be the thing that you can give to someone when they're first embarking on their long haul journey, or when they feel like, they're not sure, they've hit a wall and they're not sure where to turn. And so I wanted, first and foremost, the book to provide that level of emotional support. And so when putting together the chapters, I really was thinking about, contributors who I know had experienced that social and emotional isolation, and had also found ways to combat it. So, thinking about that, I think about Shamir Smith's chapter. Shamir wrote a very beautiful chapter on finding a caregiver, and, kind of learning to ask for help, navigating cultural stereotypes around asking for help. And I think it's, in my mind, that chapter is really emblematic of this sort of advice that I think is less in the vein of kind of, this is a supplement you should take, or, here's how to manage this symptom, but advice that is incredibly relevant and ultimately life-saving in a lot of situations. The second primary goal is to provide that sort of logistical advice of, symptom management techniques and, tests you can ask your doctors to run. And so two chapters that come to mind there are Heather Hogan's chapter on navigating dysautonomia. It is really chock full of kind of the information I definitely would have wanted to know when I first got sick, symptom management techniques and lifestyle interventions like increasing sodium and, learning about orthostatic intolerance and how to navigate that, buying certain chairs and compression socks, as well as conversations to ask with your doctor, how to ask your doctor to run a tilt table test, how to run your own tilt table test from home if it's not safe to access a doctor's office during a pandemic case surge, that sort of thing, as well as, of course, medications. And then Donna's chapter comes to mind as well. I actually love, Donna, do you want to detail a couple of kind of the call outs in your chapter in terms of tangible advice?
Yeah, I think that in our chapter, it's actually a combination of the two things that you've talked about so far, which is, I think, providing emotional support in the way of validation of patient symptoms, despite the fact that many of us faced for a long time, and I think still continue to face, erasure of our experiences by the medical establishment. Yeah, and then of course, I think we also provide practical advice there on how to engage with your physician to make sure that you are a strong advocate for yourself. So yeah, I mean, I think those things are actually super huge. So many of the people that I was put in touch with, a lot of my colleagues actually at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, were reaching out to me because I had personal experience with this disease and the perspective that I had both as a physician and as a scientist, and I guess thirdly as a patient. And I think that one of the greatest things that I was able to do for people was to validate them, right? In all of those roles. And I think that is part of what this chapter aims to do, the one that we co-wrote with Rachel and with David. Yeah.
Yeah, and that chapter, I mean, it's a very meaty chapter with tables of tests you can ask your providers to run, and questions that you can ask when you are at the doctor's office, and other chapters that come to mind. Karen Bischoff and Leticia Suarez and Allison Sobrano wrote an excellent chapter on navigating disability benefits and employment issues, employment accommodations, that sort of thing. There's, those are kind of some of the chapters, as well as Terry Wilder and Yohaira M's chapter on cognitive dysfunction. Those chapters really delve into, some of the logistical advice for symptom management and, how to navigate these issues. I also wanted the book to kind of bear witness to what we all had experienced and allow patients to tell their own histories. And some chapters that come to mind there, Padma Priya wrote a beautiful chapter, a very moving chapter about founding her support group in India after being in the ICU during one of India's most deadly waves. And that is a really important moment in history. That was a pivotal moment in the pandemic, both for acute COVID and long COVID. Her chapter really ties together the fact that where there is a significant COVID wave, acute COVID wave, there is also going to be a significant wave of long COVID, and the ways that different countries with different resources are handling that issue. And I also want to mention Carla Monteroso's chapter on navigating medical racism. This is the first chapter in our book, and I think it is a chapter that a lot of people can relate to. Carla, this chapter is another one that I think kind of provides that, emotional support. But it's also, I mean, she has an onboarding guide to COVID in that chapter that is translated into both English and Spanish that she created early in her experience, that she shares with her family and her friends. And we put it in the book because, it's one of those things that's just really helpful. So I think the book kind of tries to do all these things while sparking conversations. We have a chapter about menstrual issues, and just last night we did a conversation with journalist David Tuller, and that chapter came up even though it wasn't the topic of conversation, because so many people are unaware that menstrual issues actually can accompany a long COVID diagnosis, and that's precisely why that chapter is in the book, to kind of destigmatize that conversation and just get that discussion going. And similarly, Lisa McCorkle's chapter on navigating research, that's an advice-oriented chapter, but in a very different way, where we're not necessarily outlining the most important research studies, because this is a book and research is evolving. We're giving patients the tools to empower themselves to understand and vet emerging research so that, they're not falling prey to the misinformation that's circulating, on social media, or even the, kind of clickbait headlines we might see in certain media publications, but are actually able to decipher for themselves, what is important and what isn't. So, the book has a lot of objectives, and I'm kind of categorizing the chapters. All of these chapters, I think, do all of these things. But that's kind of a sampling to give you a sense of what we're aiming to do in the book.
Donna, let's talk about your chapter for a second. your chapter sort of is about the obstacle course of getting a diagnosis, and Fiona has mentioned some of the hurdles. In addition to, and we know very well from the ME/CFS community, the sort of gaslighting that goes on, or the disbelief of the symptoms or the dismissal of the symptoms. What do you think some of the biggest hurdles are to getting a long COVID diagnosis?
I mean, I think it still remains the case that we don't have like something that we've converged upon. It's like what signifies a long COVID diagnosis, right? And then even the methods that we have to some objective way determine whether someone had COVID and therefore could have this constellation of symptoms that we are calling long COVID. Those things are also not accurate, right? So like you have a lot of false negatives still. And that's just true for the technology that is PCR testing, for instance, right? The rapid antigen testing, it's like 25 to 50% false negative. And that's super problematic if that's what you're relying on to make a diagnosis. The flip side of that is that when you don't have something like that to rely on, then I think that patients have to be aware that we are then susceptible as physicians as potentially mislabeling or mischaracterizing something as long COVID, which doesn't have a definitive intervention, right? Whereas you could have some other systemic illness that might have a definitive intervention. And so then if you do that on the other side of this, then I think that's a problem for the patient, because then they're not getting treatment for something that might not be long COVID. And, the questions like, for how long do you actually regard something as potentially long COVID? I think those are unanswered questions. We know that or we have come up with the definition, let's say, just kind of operationalized what we're calling long COVID. But how long is it reasonable to say this is as a function of this exposure to this virus and this infection with this virus, however many days or months or weeks, weeks or months or years ago, right? So yeah, I think it's just it's technically challenging. That makes it challenging for patients to obtain diagnoses. It's very confusing, I think, to people, including physicians. There are some physicians who will say, I think an increasing number of physicians actually, who will say, using different criteria, just depending on where you are, that something is long COVID without those tests that I mentioned, right? PCR test, rapid antigen test, the antibody tests that we have, that are, again, not going to be 100%. So it's reasonable that people are using other criteria then to make those diagnoses. But, there are problems also with that. So yeah, it's very challenging.
This question just came in from our audience, and I think it's relevant here. Do you have advice for someone who is unsure if their symptoms add up to long COVID? They say it's so easy for forgetfulness, fatigue, depression, et cetera, to be chalked up to other things like stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other very confounding thing is during the pandemic, where we've been unusually isolated socially from one another, those symptoms oftentimes emerge in that context as well. I think that it is very important, if you have access, ideally, for you to go see a physician to evaluate those symptoms and to think through what we call a differential diagnosis, right? So those are all of the things that we think about as physicians as potentially explanations for what symptoms that you exhibit. And some of those things have, as I mentioned, very definitive treatments, right? Some of those things might not, like long COVID, right? But there might be many things you can do for symptom management, but there's not a definitive treatment that we know of at this time. So it's important for them to work through that with you. It's important for you to advocate for yourself and to ask for that process to be explained to you. What is on your differential, right? And how are we going to work through that differential? What are the implications, right, of the things that we are considering as the potential explanation for the disease that I have, or the constellation of symptoms that I have? I think that is actually really important for people to understand their own disease, and the steps that they can take, even in the absence actually of a definitive diagnosis, to manage the symptoms that they have.
One of the things, sorry, Fiona, were you about to say something, or?
I was just going to say that I think another helpful insight from Donna's chapter, it was co-written with Rachel Robles, who is a member of the Patient-Led Research Collaborative. And Rachel writes a lot about her own decision-making process when seeking care and how she personally decided she wanted to really try and seek treatments for root causes rather than symptoms. So not necessarily, pursuing the migraine medication, but trying to pursue, something that was going to treat the reactivated virus that, might be causing the headache. But she's very clear that, that's what she decided. And I found that personally, as a long hauler myself, very helpful just in terms of thinking about, and I think this is another answer to that question, thinking through what am I seeking, right? Am I seeking kind of, because it's different for everyone. In my case, I am seeking relief for, even momentary for these headaches that I'm having right now. And that's kind of the most important thing for me in this moment. And maybe that will change down the line. And I will be more interested in, seeking a root cause diagnosis and, something more similar to what Rachel's looking into. But I think just knowing that it's kind of up to each patient, and also that there is an energy expenditure involved in seeking care, and that you have to be aware of that and be aware of, the energy and the time and the money that goes into this, and whether or not it's always worth it. And just knowing it's a super personal decision, and that you get to create that decision calculus for yourself.
Let's talk about.
I wanted to just say one more thing, because I think that this is pertinent not just to long COVID. And I think this is what has helped me, and I hope many others understand, the lens that long COVID gives us into how we think about disease in general, and how we think about intervening in disease in general, right? So in many diseases, I think in particular, because we live in an age where we are surrounded by this kind of profit-driven medical model, biomedical model, where we aren't often looking to what the root causes are. And often it actually is more energy and effort, as Fiona mentioned, to address those root causes. So as an example, right, as a neurologist, I would see people come in with strokes, with heart attacks, which there were a lot of risk factors for most of those people who came into the hospital with those conditions. And there are many things you could have done prior to that to address some of those causes of that outcome. But people didn't, or they couldn't, right? And so some people end up leaving the hospital with satisfied with the multiple medications now they're on to manage all of those risk factors, and to just address that in the moment. And you do have to do that, of course. But some of those people are not necessarily motivated or able to actually go backwards and address those things to prevent further issues, right? They would rather just use the medications to address the acute issue now and to try to prevent with those medications, as opposed to kind of doing the other things that might also, I think, in a more profound way, help to reduce your probability of having another stroke or another heart attack. So I think the same thing is true here, as Fiona mentioned, in many other diseases. Yeah.
One of the things that we are seeing with both ME/CFS and long COVID, because as you both said, sort of that specific diagnosis, right, of, oh, you have cancer, this is what we do with it. There are so many sort of anomalous, amorphous symptoms. How important is it for the community to work together on this? And we had a couple of questions from the audience too about how can advocates and patients talk to medical professionals to better educate them, our families, and better educate them. There's lots of groups out there who don't believe that this is something, or are sort of judging, or may seem to be judging. How do we deal with that? Does the book talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of personal anecdotes in this book of, people having those conversations, those difficult interactions with family and friends and employers. And, a couple of people in the book recount kind of bringing media articles to, even to providers or to, employers, or family and friends. In some situations, bringing research studies. I think many of us have been in that situation, saying, look, Dr. Fauci said that this is real, it is. And, that can have varying effects depending on who you're talking to. I think on a more macro level, it's important to keep in mind that there are, kind of pundits and players in media who are very keen on emphasizing this rigid divide between providers and patients, especially when it comes to, complex chronic illnesses like long COVID. But that divide is in some ways manufactured. I mean, obviously it can exist, but, we're sitting here with Donna, who is both a provider and a patient, right? And, obviously David Petrino also was a collaborator on this project. He himself is not a long COVID patient, but has been a collaborator with long COVID patients throughout this process. And so, I feel very hopeful that that kind of tide is changing, and that there are real inroads being made. In day-to-day life, I am encouraging people to, I joke that people should passively aggressively gift this book to their relatives and their neighbors. But truly, I have heard from people who don't have long COVID and who have read this book, I've expected people to say, oh, it really gave me insight into, what it's like to live with long COVID. And I've heard that, but I've actually also heard people say, it helped me process the pandemic. And so I think that, books like this, and there are other books, of course, that have come out and that will come out on this pandemic and on chronic illness during this pandemic, are a way to kind of collectively process what we've gone through. I think one of the issues right now is that people are very afraid to speak about this stuff publicly, and there's a real erasure going on. And so the more that we can do to kind of normalize conversations about loss and grief, whether it's, the loss of a loved one who died of COVID, there's been some excellent coalition building between grief groups like Marked by COVID, which organizes, the bereaved and people with long COVID and, ME/CFS and high risk and immunocompromised people. Those are the coalitions we need to continue to build. And I think we need to continue to really talk about that stuff at our Thanksgiving dinner table, right? And especially if there's anyone watching this who doesn't have long COVID, that's really the role that we need allies to take in kind of stepping up and normalizing those conversations. So hopefully that answered your question to some degree. I think I went off a little bit on a tangent there, but it's hard. And I don't think there's any magic bullet, but I hope that books like this and the conversations and the work that groups like Patient-Led Research, and Body Politic and others are doing is moving the needle a little bit.
I think it's important also to define loss, right? Because it's not just loss of life, somebody unfortunately passing away, right? With people with long COVID, people with ME/CFS lose so much more, even if they are still alive and breathing, right? You lose your ability to work, your ability to do the things that you enjoy doing and exercise and stuff like that. So I think I would assume that that's also maybe covered a little bit, or at least something else that we should be talking about.
Yeah, I think that one of the most profound things, because of the neurological symptoms that people experience, the cognitive symptoms that people experience, is loss of identity. And part of that is tied up in actually what we're able to do for a living, right? And so I think you really grapple with existential questions about your life and who you are, I think, with this disease, more so than maybe something that doesn't affect the nervous system, so particularly the central nervous system. But yeah, there is a lot of loss and grief, I think, even for people who don't die from the disease.
Yeah, and I want to just briefly mention here Morgan Stevens' chapter. She's a CNN journalist who wrote a chapter in the book on mental health that digs into, why we know long COVID is not psychosomatic, but also the very real mental health impacts of this illness. And she talks about that loss of self and kind of, going from being this very kind of high achieving, person on a career path, very clear career path, to having to reckon with, that loss of being able to kind of pursue the things she did before. So I think for folks who are navigating that, I would definitely recommend giving that chapter a look.
Fiona, you mentioned research a little bit. For both of you, how do you think that long COVID has impacted the role of patients in research?
Well, I think, the Patient-Led Research Collaborative, which was born out of the Body Politic support group, I think, I think they are fundamentally changing the way that research is engaging with patients. This is not completely new. HIV/AIDS advocates, I think, started to kind of build this path before them in the 80s and 90s, and fought for meaningful engagement in setting research agendas and making sure that if they had not done that, I think the progress for HIV treatments would have gone very differently, right? They were the people saying, hey, the primary drug that you're all pushing is actually not working. The side effects are too intense. It's failing patients. And so I think the role of kind of patients' lived experiences in determining research agendas is something that Patient-Led has pushed really hard for, and is something that's going to continue. What I'm hoping this book can do is democratize that process even further by, kind of giving patients beyond even just, the Patient-Led Research Collaborative and the folks that are directly involved in advocacy, but just readers of this book, the tools to understand emerging research, and maybe that doesn't mean they're getting involved on the level of like serving on an NIH committee, but I'm hopeful that it means that they're able to decipher, what emerging research is and isn't important to them, what they should or shouldn't be asking their doctors about. At the very least, when they see a headline, or they hear someone at a dinner party saying, well, I heard that exercise is the only way to recover from long COVID, and I heard there's studies to support it, that they're able to go home and, look up those studies and decide for themselves if that's correct, right? Rather than just absorbing that information and, potentially going down the wrong path.
Yeah, I've been involved with the Patient-Led Research Collaborative. Like most recently, we were evaluating, I think, about $5 million worth of grant applications for long COVID research. And I was really just astounded how different this process was from, I was many years ago now, like in an academic medical context, where I applied for grants, looked at other people's grants, and it was nothing like the same, like the things that we were asking people to propose. And we actually gathered together as a group of people who were directly impacted by long COVID to come up with a criteria for evaluating these applications. The things that we were asking people to do and the things that they did in search of the funding, right? It was amazing to me, actually, that we could really fundamentally transform potentially how research is done, right? I still think that there is a long way to go because I've been on the other side of this. I am a consultant in clinical trials, right? In the EEG space or brainwave, test space. And I think there is still a long way to go, but that, change starts somewhere. And I think it's important what Fiona has mentioned in terms of democratizing access to change making. I think that being more scientifically literate is something, honestly, that should be taught in K-12 education so that you can discern what is happening in science, actually, because it really can impact your life. But yeah, no. So I'm so grateful to be a part of all of it. Yeah.
It's important to mention that, and it's actually something that we at Solve are initiating too, to better educate patients about research so that they can go advocate for that at all levels, not just personally, but out there with other organizations and be part of those kind of advisory groups, advising on patient-led research. It is super important. Especially, I think, in this case, because we don't know a lot about, again, the root causes. Mm-hmm. So, again, if you have cancer, science has done a really good job of understanding what causes cancer and can deal with that without necessarily the patient viewpoint. But I think here the patient viewpoint is so much because they aren't, the symptoms are not as diagnosable in that same way. Mm-hmm. So looking forward in terms of long COVID, ME/CFS advocacy, what's the future of that, do you think, going to look like? How is that going to move? And what might be some meaningful wins that we can find in the advocacy arena?
Well, I think, we're going to have to see. I think that as Donna mentioned, I think actually there is, if there hasn't been already, going to be a big patient-led research announcement today about the awardees of this grant money. So hopefully we're going to see some really good research moving forward. I know also we, are seeing more coalition building, as I mentioned, like groups like Marked by COVID, working with long haulers. I know that JD Davids, who's one of the contributors to this book, he's been trying to reach out to, a lot of different health justice organizations. He's done a lot of work connecting with folks in the HIV/AIDS space and, doing seminars that are targeted toward people living with HIV to help them understand the risks of long COVID for that population. So I think that sort of coalition building is really the future of long COVID. And of course, we've seen that with ME/CFS advocacy already with, actions like Millions Missing, where you have ME/CFS advocacy organizations really leading events for, long haulers and people with chronic illnesses more generally. I think my concern right now is that I'm worried about the future of peer support and real grassroots community support. To start, we haven't had the type of grassroots community support on a local level that we need. We have had these digital and virtual support groups, but we have to keep in mind that those groups, while they're super accessible in some ways, they're also not accessible to people who are not able to get on the internet, who are not able to access or navigate that type of software. And so that's part of the reason I wanted to put a book like this out there, so that there is some sort of, hard copy that someone can get at a library or, share with a friend. If you don't have access to a computer, you're not used to navigating a website like Slack or Facebook. But even when we talk about these larger support groups like Body Politic or the COVID-19 Long Hauler Advocacy Project, I'm concerned because most of them are not well funded. Most of them have no institutional funding. And if we look at the history of a movement like HIV/AIDS, we saw that research was, ultimately got really good funding and moved forward. But a lot of small local community groups that were life-saving for individuals dissolved in the early 2000s, in the 90s and the early 2000s. And, research has progressed hugely for HIV, but there is still an HIV epidemic, and it is disproportionately affecting, Black men in the rural South. And the reason that, one of the reasons for that is that we don't have the community group infrastructure. We don't have a funded community organization infrastructure that we should. We don't have the sort of funded federal communications campaign on HIV that we should. We have the Ryan White Care Act, but we don't have, we don't have PrEP for All, right? So we see how these sorts of movements to, fund research, they can kind of go out of vogue, right? And we can end up with a situation where patients are left in the lurch and where treatments become available, but they're not accessible for everyone. And so that's my real concern, when I see, advocates like Shamir Smith and Angela Vasquez and Karen Bishop, those are three, impacted, disabled women of color who have been leading unfunded community work for 2 years. I'm not sure how much longer these advocates are going to be able to go on. And their work is incredibly vital. And it's life-sustaining. And that's the type of thing that I feel like we need to be investing in, as much as we're investing in research. My other concern is, of course, and I think patient-led research would echo this, Lisa McCorkle was talking about it last night, we need to make sure that that money for research is not reinventing the wheel and is building off of, the years of research that, groups like Solve-ME have been investing in research into other infection-associated chronic illnesses. Because with the Recover Initiative, what I'm hearing from the advocates that are involved is that far too often, they're not bringing in researchers who have experience in those illnesses, and it's kind of just starting from scratch in too many instances, and that's going to be a waste of time. That's going to be a waste of money. So those are kind of my concerns right now. I am still optimistic about the patient power that's been built over the past 2 years, but I think we need to be wary of some of the mistakes that have been made in the past.
Are you worried? This question just came to me in response to what you were saying. Are we worried that right now COVID is top of mind for people? But that's not to say that a year from now or 6 months from now, another virus is going to, that is similar to COVID in how serious it is, but different, not building on COVID, and that long COVID kind of gets shoved out of the way for something else. Is that a concern? I mean, I think time is really of the essence then, yeah?
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's important. I mean, obviously the specific details about long COVID I think are very important to understand. But I think it's almost equally as important to understand kind of more generally or thematically, like what is happening in terms of like, if we talk about the science of it, it's like in terms of autoimmunity or chronic inflammation or viral persistence or all of these things, which also can happen in other like infections, right? But I think if we talk about it in terms of also kind of the illness experience from the patient's perspective and the societal response, there are similarities, I think, with a lot of other illnesses. And understanding why it is that patients are not getting what we need in the way of support to navigate through this condition and to not just survive, but to thrive in the face of it. I think, connecting the dots is really important, right? And so like, even if another viral condition comes along and it creates another like, pandemic of like sustained reactions that people are experiencing, right, physiologically, I think it's important to step back and to look at kind of the patterns between these different instances. And also, I will have to say, it's not just like everything that we've talked about today. I feel so much of it is pertinent to conversations that we have in social justice spaces, in movement building spaces, right? So thinking about how we come together, how we connect the dots, how we combine our resources, how we address the issues that are disproportionately affecting people who are most vulnerable by a particular thing, whatever that thing is. I think that is so critical. And it's something that people tend to lose sight of when we're so mired in our own thing, the thing that's really just impacting us. But if we step back, we'll understand how this is part of the human condition, right? It's like, it's all interrelated. And that I think, to me, it's actually kind of like, it makes me feel more connected, right, to everybody in the world, to know that like we're all struggling in some way and we're all actually grappling with these systems in some way that are making our life experience just more difficult than it needs to be. And we need to understand that collectively, and we need to kind of come together to transform those systems that are impacting all of us, even though we have different things going on in our lives.
Absolutely. I similarly feel like, when I mentioned earlier that one of the goals of the book was kind of to bear witness to what we had experienced and to tell our own histories, that is also because, I benefited from being able to go back into the archives and read the personal histories of people who had organized around HIV/AIDS, people who had organized as part of the women's health movement, Black Panthers who had set up community health clinics. Those were blueprints that, I and members of patient-led research and members of Body Politic were looking at when we were trying to figure out what to do. And so in many ways, I'm hopeful that this book can provide some kind of blueprint for whatever next generation comes. So I think to answer your question, I am worried that the pandemic is going to become less relevant to people, because we've already seen that happen, that there is this kind of mass media erasure or attempt at mass erasure in pop culture and media, to pretend like nothing is happening and there's no kind of lasting effects, and not to really memorialize or even reckon with what has happened. And I'm also worried that we're not prepared for the next pandemic, and we're not prepared for the next major public health issue, both in the sense of, literal pandemic preparedness. Are we funding those bodies of government? Are we funding those health agencies? But also in terms of, do we actually, as a society, understand now that, recovery from illness is not just a light switch that you flip on or off, right? And that most health issues do have some sort of kind of nebulous, potentially long-term recovery, even if we're talking about a broken ankle. The way that we talk about, the way that we talk about recovery is really so inaccurate to most people's experience. So I think what I think about more is just in terms of long COVID work. Yes, this is called the Long COVID Survival Guide. It is about long COVID, but it is in many ways, I think, a book that is relevant to anyone that's navigating a complex chronic illness, anyone that's navigating a healthcare system, in this country, but it of course includes perspectives from all over the world. And my hope is that, together we're building on kind of lessons from past movements, you know, that I've mentioned, but that this is the type of thing that, you know, will be helpful to people who are, you know, disabled by future climate disasters, or, you know, who find that you know, I've been thinking about also when we were in the early days of organizing around this, there were people who had been disabled, you know, by police brutality in protests around George Floyd in summer of 2020. I mean, there are so many of us that are living with, you know, disabilities and chronic illnesses that could have been prevented or could have been mitigated, and now are not receiving the support that also could have been set up in advance of those issues. And so I think all of this is kind of about a long history of, you know, chronic illness and infection associated disease, and looking forward and trying to do better next time and set up that kind of community support, because it does seem clear that, you know, our governments are not necessarily thinking ahead in that same way.
Fiona, you mentioned a little bit at the beginning that some of the experiences of ME/CFS patients informed your work here. How can you go a little bit into that and how that impacted your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very early on, I first want to say that people with ME/CFS predicted long COVID. You know, prior to the pandemic, my awareness of ME/CFS was not good. And I should have been more aware. And I was taken by surprise when I got sick and didn't get better. And, you know, I now know, of course, that Jennifer Brea was tweeting, you know, March 1st saying this is going to happen. And along with many others, of course. And so when I wrote that kind of first article in the New York Times in early April, that seems to be kind of the first account of what we you know, in a mainstream media publication, what we now call long COVID, I had not connected with people in the ME/CFS community. But in writing that article, I got connected to people like Terry Wilder and Jennifer Brea and Allison Sabrana and JD Davids and others. And they were really, really important to my early journey with long COVID and many others, both in the sense of helping us understand our symptoms, helping us understand post-exertional malaise. That is, you know, obviously a characterizing symptom of long COVID for many, many patients. And it's a very hard symptom to understand if you have never been introduced to it before. I now realize that I experienced PEM earlier in my life after a mono infection as an adolescent, but still did not understand what it was, right? And so, you know, I wish I'd had that framework back then. I was very lucky to get it super early on in my illness, and I credit the ME/CFS community and their knowledge of, you know, rest and pacing and that kind of, you know, information with, you know, a lot of the recovery that I did end up making in my early phase with the disease. But beyond that, folks like Terry Wilder and others also kind of provided that blueprint for health justice advocacy. They connected members of Body Politic with individual, you know, elected officials who were open to having conversations. They showed us what it might look like to organize online, right? Because we had a virtual support group, but we didn't necessarily know what it might look like to create a hashtag or gather communities on Twitter or start to pull in new people into the support group. So I think that, you know, they were incredibly welcoming and generous. And I know also that it hasn't been easy to see this topic kind of explode after years and years and years of neglect. And so I think, you know, in return, what's very important to me is that the long COVID movement makes sure to always ground that history of ME/CFS advocacy and the history of, you know, infection-associated illnesses, making clear that long COVID is not brand new. It is not this incredibly mysterious thing that just popped up yesterday, and we have to pay attention to and center the experiences of people who have been living with this and talking about it for, you know, decades.
We have time for a few questions that were sent in prior, but before we do that, I know we have some people who have tuned in as the webinar has been going on, and we know that one of the questions that was sent in was where people can get the book in Canada. Fiona, will you just repeat the title and let people know where they can get it here and in Canada for folks who may have tuned in late?
Yes, so the book is the Long COVID Survival Guide. how to take care of yourself and what comes next. It is available from all major booksellers, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Currently, you should be able to order it from Amazon from Canada. It is also available as an ebook anywhere where books are sold in Canada. And I'm now reading a text message from the publicist because I texted her about this morning. She said, any day now, the shipment of paperbacks will finish processing through shipping to retailers. So you should be able to order it from your local bookstore in Canada if it's not already in stock. So if it's not already in stock at your local bookstore in Canada, it should be soon. Otherwise, the ebook should be available, and it should be available for order from Amazon. An audiobook will also be coming. It just is a little more, that process is happens after the print version. So they're basically recording the audiobook right now.
Thank you. Donna, this question for the audience may be best directed to you. What guidance would you offer for patients who had pre-existing chronic illness who are now dealing with long COVID?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that came up actually in our chapter, is that like, in trying to define what long COVID is, right? And it's like, well, it could be the exacerbation of a prior illness that you had. I mean, I think it would be good, as always, like to check in with your physician who had been managing actually that chronic illness. I don't know if for this individual, the chronic illness was like subdued or at bay before getting kind of reignited because of COVID. But I think that is important to look at, especially if that actually did have some kind of therapy that was associated with it that might have been discontinued, temporarily. That is something that at least symptomatically might help them to address the exacerbation of the symptoms that they might be experiencing. I mean, I don't know what the condition is too, right? So like there might be some definitive intervention that might be warranted. Yeah, so I think that's probably the best thing. I don't know. I don't know if Fiona, you can offer any further advice there.
Yeah, I mean, that I agree. I think the only other thing that I've kind of heard is I do know that for patients that are, middle-aged or a little bit older, and patients that have a history of chronic illness, it can be very difficult to get providers to take potential post-COVID symptoms seriously, because I have heard from a lot of patients in that situation that it's often chalked up to, oh, well, this is just a progression of that previous chronic illness, or this is just a progression of aging. So I think, just making sure to get a second opinion if that is the answer that you get. And, Donna talks a lot in the chapter about just always, of course, making sure that your provider feels like a partner in your care journey. So, as Donna said, it can be hard to know what is what if they are post, COVID or long COVID symptoms, or if it is a progression, potentially of an existing chronic illness. But if you have a provider who you feel like trusts you and who you trust, hopefully that's a conversation that can actually be had. So, trying to find a provider like that. The other thing I'll say is there are quite a few people in this situation. There are a number of people in the Body Politic support group I know who are in this situation. I'm not sure if you're in that group, but it may be worth checking out. JD Davids, who's one of the contributors to the survival guide, is a person who has long COVID, but also lived with a variety of chronic illnesses before getting long COVID. He's on Twitter as at the cranky queer. So it might be worth checking out some of his work as well, because he tends to talk about this a fair amount too.
That Body Politic group, I cannot like emphasize enough how I think life-changing it can be for people to connect in that space, because people they have so much lived experience and wisdom that you can benefit from. I almost wanted to prescribe it to people, the colleagues who reached out to me, and they didn't know what to do. They thankfully were compassionate enough to acknowledge this seems to be a real thing, but I don't know what to do. And that's their honest answer. And so I would always point them to Body Politic.
And actually, sorry, just one last thing I'll say, and you may already be aware of this, is that, anecdotally, it does seem to be the case that certainly people who previously had EDS and had had dysautonomia do seem often to develop long COVID. That's just something that, we've encountered quite a bit. In fact, I've encountered quite a few long haulers who were kind of retroactively diagnosed with EDS after developing long COVID, as well as long haulers. I myself, I believe, had symptoms of dysautonomia and post-viral POTS earlier in my life, but it was just not diagnosed. So, just to know that there does seem sometimes to be a link between having, a prior chronic illness and then going on to develop long COVID.
And this is probably also a good point to mention that we cannot be giving medical advice here, that these are opinions, and please talk to your doctors and physicians as best as you can for those things. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up here. We want to announce our winners. One of our audience also made sure to mention that you can also request that your local library purchase the book, and so that they can have it in stock for you to check out if you cannot purchase it yourself. And so once again, we want to remind you, and we hope that you enjoyed the webinar. Our webinars are free. But our research, our advocacy, our educational programs, these webinars are only possible with donor support. And we are in the middle of our year-end campaign. And we hope that if you can, you would consider contributing to Solve so that we can continue to fund research studies, we continue to fund educational programs, and we can continue to fund our advocacy programs. And if you are technologically savvier than I am, you can use the QR code on the screen to donate, or you can go to solveme.org/donate to make a contribution as well. We also have, as we said, we are giving away 15 copies of the book. And so on the slide right now are our winners. Congratulations to you. We will be ordering a copy of the book and sending it direct to you. So we will reach out via email to get a mailing address for that. Everybody else, please go and purchase this book. Ask your library to purchase this book. Purchase it for your friends and family so that they can help understand what we are going to. Thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you very much, Donna. We really appreciate the time you spent with us today and all the great information that you gave to our audience.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.